The cell phone rang at exactly 3 in the morning, cutting my dreams like a knife. On the display was the name I least expected to see, Uncle Richard. "Eric, I hope you're awake," his voice carried a barely concealed satisfaction. "Your car is on fire in the building's garage. I hope you have insurance." I should have felt panic. I should have screamed, run to the window, or at least asked if anyone was hurt. Instead, I started laughing. Not a nervous giggle, but a genuine laugh that echoed through my small apartment. "Why the hell are you laughing?" Richard asked, clearly confused. "This is a tragedy, young man. That Civic was all you had." "Because, Uncle," I replied, still laughing, "that car wasn't just my mode of transportation. My name is Eric, I'm 29 years old, and I've spent the last 5 years struggling to establish myself as a graphic designer in Seattle. When my phone rang on that cold November morning, I never imagined it would be my own uncle giving me the news that would change everything between us. What shocked him more than the fire was my reaction. How could I laugh at losing the only valuable thing I owned? The truth is, that car meant much more to me than Richard could ever imagine. Before I explain why I laughed at what should have been devastating news, I need to go back in time. I grew up in a lower middle-class family in Tacoma, where everyone knew everyone else, and dreams rarely extended beyond the city limits. My parents, especially my mother Carol, believed in stability above all else. My father died when I was 16, leaving us with debt and a mortgage. Richard, my father's younger brother, took a completely different direction in life. While Dad worked in a factory, Richard invested in technology in the early 90s. By the age of 50, he owned 3 companies and lived in a mansion in Bellevue that looked more like a luxury hotel. There had always been tension between us. When I chose graphic design in college, Richard made his opinion clear: "Art doesn't pay the bills, kid. You should study business and come work for me." My mother, a widow struggling to pay the bills, secretly agreed with him. Despite her objections, I moved to Seattle 5 years ago with 2 suitcases and a determination that soon proved insufficient against the reality of the city's astronomical rents. The first year was brutal. I shared apartments with 3 different people, worked 2 jobs while trying to build my client portfolio. That's when I found my current apartment in Capitol Hill. It wasn't very impressive, a studio on the 3rd floor of a 1970s building with thin walls and inconsistent heat. But it had 2 qualities that won me over. It was surprisingly cheap for the location, and it had a huge north-facing window, perfect for my work setup. The building's landlord, Mr. Chun, was an 80-year-old Chinese gentleman who had bought the property decades ago. He operated more on handshakes than formal contracts, and rarely raised rent on long-time tenants. My neighbors were artists, students, and workers who had lived there for years. Every time Richard visited our mother, he would ask, "Have you gotten better insurance for your things?" And I would always promise to look into it the following week. There was always a more pressing expense: design equipment, project materials, or simply groceries when clients were late paying. The Civic Richard mentioned was a 2005 model I bought used 3 years ago. It wasn't pretty, but it was reliable for driving to clients and transporting materials for events. The insurance only covered the basics. If someone hit the car, I would be in serious financial trouble. Looking back, I should have noticed the warning signs. About 8 months ago, strange things started happening in the building. The front door was sometimes found unlocked in the morning, even though all the residents were careful. There were 2 small fires in the basement, quickly brought under control but worrisome nonetheless. Mr. Chun seemed distant when we reported these problems. It wasn't his usual benevolent indifference, but something more evasive, almost nervous. Meanwhile, my career was finally starting to take off. A respected agency in Belltown had agreed to hire me as a regular freelancer, and I was developing a visual identity for a restaurant that was opening next month. 3 days before the fire, I noticed men in suits walking around the building with clipboards. When I asked one of them who they were, he smiled rehearsedly and said they were doing a routine inspection. His expensive clothes and polished shoes didn't fit with typical city inspectors. That night, I fell asleep surrounded by the familiar smell of ink and possibilities, completely unaware that it would be my last night in that apartment. The harsh ring of the phone jolted me from dreams of project deadlines and client meetings. "Eric," Richard's voice cut through my drowsiness. "I just saw it on the news. Your building is on fire. It looks like it started in the garage and is spreading quickly. Please tell me you're not there." For a moment, I couldn't process his words. My building? What fire? Then laughter burst from my chest. Not a small laugh, but a full, almost hysterical guffaw. Eric, this isn't funny, Richard insisted. You could have lost everything. Please tell me you listened to me about getting better insurance. My laughter only increased. When I finally managed to control myself, I explained, Uncle, I'm not at home because I decided to bring all my equipment to the agency office yesterday. The project deadline is tomorrow, and I thought it would be easier to work there late. The irony was overwhelming. After years of being lectured about not properly protecting my assets, the one night I needed to be out of the house was the one night I wasn't. And the most valuable things I owned, my computer, tablet, design equipment, were safely stored elsewhere. My laughter subsided as a terrible realization hit me. Uncle, I have to hang up. My neighbors. I need to make sure they all got out safely. I hung up before he could respond and called my neighbor Janet, a retired nurse who lived in the apartment next door. When she didn't answer, I tried Tom, a musician who lived downstairs. Nothing. Panic began to replace my earlier euphoria. I grabbed an Uber and quickly dressed in the clothes I had left scattered around my bedroom. 20 minutes later, the driver dropped me off 2 blocks away from the building because police barricades prevented closer access. The scene was chaotic and terrifying. Flames were still visible rising from the upper floors, painting the night sky orange. Fire trucks blocked the street, their sirens creating a deafening symphony. Water gushed from hoses, creating streams that ran through the gutters carrying ash and debris. If you're enjoying discovering how a seemingly devastating fire became the catalyst for an all-changing discovery, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. But what I didn't know yet, as I ran through the crowd of homeless and curious people looking for familiar faces, was that this fire had not been an accident. And my Uncle Richard knew that long before he made that call. I found Janet first, wrapped in a Red Cross blanket near an ambulance. Her gray hair was tousled, and she was coughing intermittently, but she smiled when she saw me. Eric, thank God you're okay, she said, hugging me tightly. We thought you were still inside. The firefighters did 3 complete sweeps of your floor. Where's everyone else? I asked, scanning the faces in the crowd. Tom's over there talking to the paramedics. The Martinez family left early, they're staying with their children. But Eric, her voice trailed off. No one can find Mr. Chun. My stomach dropped. Mr. Chun was always home. At 80, he rarely left after 6 in the evening. I spent the next hour in agony, watching firefighters go in and out of the building. The fire chief, a determined woman with kind eyes, updated us periodically. We're doing a thorough search. The fire appears to have started in the garage and spread through the ventilation ducts. Finally, around 5 in the morning, they confirmed that everyone was accounted for. Mr. Chun had spent the night at his daughter's house in Bellevue, his first absence in years. No one was seriously injured, although several residents, including Tom, were treated for smoke inhalation. When the sun rose fully, the destruction became even more apparent. Our building stood like a charred skeleton, windows blown out, the brick facade blackened. Water was still dripping from the structure, and the air smelled of wet ash and melted plastic. That's when my phone rang again. Richard. Eric, you need to come home. His voice had a tone I couldn't quite place. Your mother is worried. I came from Bellevue as soon as I heard. You're here. I looked around for his black BMW. At the Starbucks on Pine Street. Come on, we need to talk. 20 minutes later, I found Richard sitting at a table in the back, impeccably dressed despite the hour. At 50, he looked younger than many men in their 40s, hair still thick, body in shape, a Rolex watch gleaming on his wrist. Success had polished him to perfection. Sit down, he said, pushing a coffee toward me. You look terrible. I did. My clothes were covered in soot, my eyes red from smoke and lack of sleep. How did you find out about the fire so quickly? I asked bluntly. Richard took a sip of his coffee, considering the question. Contacts. When you have business in town, people keep you informed about developments. What kind of developments? Eric, you're asking silly questions. The important thing is that you're safe and now you can finally make a smart decision about your life. He leaned forward. Come work for me. Marketing manager, $60,000 to start, with full benefits. It's time to stop this freelance art nonsense. Nonsense? Anger began to bubble up in my chest. I love my work. Love doesn't pay the rent, kid. And look where your love has gotten you. No home, no car, no security. His voice grew colder. At least now you have a choice. Something in the way he said it, the barely concealed satisfaction, the certainty that I was cornered, set off alarm bells in my mind. What do you mean, I don't have a choice? Richard sighed theatrically. Eric, let's be realistic. You're 29 years old, living in a college student's apartment, driving a 15-year-old car, without a penny to your name. This fire is an opportunity to grow. An opportunity? The words came out louder than I intended. Losing everything is an opportunity? Losing your illusions is always an opportunity, he replied coldly. Now you can focus on what matters. Real money. Real security. A real future. At that moment, I realized something disturbing. Richard didn't seem the least bit surprised or concerned about the fire. He seemed prepared. As if he knew this conversation was coming. How did you know my car was in the garage? I asked slowly. What? On the phone. You specifically said my car was on fire in the garage. How did you know where I parked? For a split second, I saw something flash across Richard's face. Then he smiled. Eric, I visited you a few times. Of course I know where the garage is. But he had visited my apartment only twice in 5 years, and we always parked on the street because the garage was for residents only. He had never been there. My phone vibrated with a message from Derek, a local reporter who had shown up at the scene of the fire earlier. Can you talk? I found something interesting about your building. I have to go, I said to Richard, getting up. Eric, don't be stupid. This is your chance at a better life. I'll think about it, I lied, already heading for the door. I found Derek at a nearby diner. He was a thin guy with glasses, carrying a briefcase full of papers. Thanks for agreeing to meet me, he said. I'm investigating a series of suspicious fires in the city. Your building is the 4th this year. 4th. They all had something in common. Old properties in gentrifying neighborhoods, recently purchased by a company called Pacific Grove Development. He opened his briefcase. The owner, Mr. Chun, sold the building to them 3 months ago. The world seemed to stop. He sold it. Yes. And here's the interesting part. Pacific Grove is a subsidiary of Blackstone Ventures, which is owned by, he checked his papers, Richard Morrison. Morrison. My mother's maiden name. The name Richard had legally adopted after marrying the daughter of a local businessman. My own uncle had bought my building. And 3 months later, he set it on fire. There's more, Derek continued. Pacific Grove applied for demolition permits for your building 2 weeks before the fire. And building permits for a new luxury building a week before. The pieces fit together with sickening clarity. Richard knew about the fire because he had orchestrated it. He had called me not out of concern, but to establish an alibi. And now he was trying to convince me to take his job as a way to maintain control over me. Can I help you with this investigation? I asked Derek. He smiled. Actually, I was hoping you'd ask me that. As I walked back to my cheap hotel that night, my mind was racing. For 5 years, Richard had criticized me for my life choices, treated me like a failure. Now I discovered he had literally burned down my house to force me to accept his vision of success. But he had made one crucial mistake. By underestimating me so badly, he had revealed his hand too soon. And unlike his previous victims, I wasn't willing to take his money and disappear quietly. That night, alone in my claustrophobic hotel room, I made a decision that would change everything between us. Richard thought he had destroyed my independence. In fact, he had created a determined enemy who knew his weaknesses better than any investigator. He always said I needed to learn about the real world of business. It was time to teach him a lesson about the real consequences of treating family like pawns in a corporate game. But first, I needed to understand exactly how deep this conspiracy went, and how many other people had been hurt by the greed of my own flesh and blood. Over the next 3 days, Richard's pressure intensified in a calculated and relentless manner. First came the constant phone calls, 5 a day, all with the same litany about missed opportunities and smart decisions. When I started ignoring them, he changed tactics. Eric, I need to tell you something about your mother. His voice sounded different on the fourth call that day. She's worried about you. She said you seem unstable lately. My blood ran cold. What did you tell her? Just the truth. That you lost your house, your car, and you're rejecting your family's help out of pride. She's considering coming to Seattle for an intervention. You know how she gets when she's worried about your mental well-being. The threat was clear. My mother had struggled with depression after my father's death, and Richard knew I would do anything to protect her from unnecessary stress. Using her mental health as leverage was low, even by his standards. Leave my mother out of this, I replied through clenched teeth. There's nothing to leave out, Eric. Just a family concerned about a young man who is clearly making poor decisions under stress. The job remains open. $65,000 to start. I hung up, but the damage was done. Richard had found my Achilles heel and would not hesitate to exploit it. Derek called later that day with news that further complicated my situation. I found 2 previous victims willing to talk, he said. But Eric, there's something you need to know first. We met at a cafe in Fremont, far from Richard's business circles. Derek seemed tense, constantly checking to see if anyone was watching us. I spoke with Angela Torres, who lost her apartment in Ballard 6 months ago, and Michael Kim, from a fire in Georgetown last year. Both confirmed the same pattern: low settlement offers, pressure to accept quickly, and subtle threats to those who resisted. What kind of threats? Angela said they started by digging into her tax history. Michael lost an important contract after someone spread rumors about financial problems. Derek lowered his voice. Eric, your uncle isn't just a common criminal. He has connections. Judges, prosecutors, businessmen. People who can make your life very difficult if you keep digging into this. Derek's words echoed in my mind as I walked back to the hotel. For the first time since the fire, I felt the real weight of what I was facing. It wasn't just Richard, it was an entire network of corruption and influence that I, an unemployed graphic designer, was trying to take on alone. That night, sitting on the narrow bed in the cheap hotel, I called my mother. Her voice carried a worry that broke my heart. Eric, Richard told me about the fire. Why didn't you call me? And why are you refusing help? Mom, it's complicated. Richard isn't offering real help. Honey, I know you two have always had your differences, but he's offering you a real job with benefits. After everything you've been through, her voice faltered. Maybe it's time to accept that some doors have closed for you. The desperation in her voice was genuine. Richard had planted seeds of doubt about my mental stability, my judgment. To her, I sounded like a stubborn young man rejecting salvation out of pride. Mom, can you give me a few more days? Please. Of course, honey. But if you need me. After hanging up, I stared at the ceiling for hours. Richard was right about one thing: I didn't have the resources for a long battle. My bank account was practically empty, my temp job didn't even cover my basic expenses, and now he was using my own family against me. It was Derek who brought me back to focus. I got something, he said when we met the next day. Angela kept all the documents. And there's something interesting: she received 2 settlement offers. 2. The first, official one, from Pacific Grove. $3,000. The second, a week later, from a law firm I'd never heard of. $15,000, but with very specific confidentiality clauses. Derek spread the papers on the table. The law firm exists, but it's just a front. Same owners as Pacific Grove. They pay more to those who show resistance, but always with contracts that prevent any public discussion of the fires. I studied the documents with growing interest. The pattern was sophisticated, creating the appearance of generosity while ensuring the victim's absolute silence. How many people accepted the larger offers? Of the 7 victims I located, 5 signed confidentiality agreements. Angela and Michael only spoke to me because the contracts have an expiration clause: 3 years. Time is running out for the first cases. An idea began to form in my mind. Derek, can you give me a complete list of all the suspicious fires? Dates, locations, property values before and after. I can try. Why? Because Richard may have lawyers and connections, but he also left a paper trail. And I know someone who's very good at finding patterns in financial data. Lisa Chun had been my partner on several design projects over the past 2 years. With a degree in applied mathematics before switching to UX design, she had a natural talent for finding correlations in large datasets. When I called to explain my situation, she agreed to help immediately. "Send me everything you have. If there's a financial pattern, I'll find it." 3 days later, Lisa called me to her apartment on Capitol Hill. Her desk was covered with printed charts and spreadsheets. "Eric, I found something important," she said, pointing to a timeline chart. "The fires aren't random. They follow an 18-month cycle, always on properties Richard bought exactly 6 months earlier." She showed me another chart. "And look at this. The insurance values he receives are always 63% higher than the purchase price. That's not a coincidence." "How do you know about the insurance?" "Public records. All the properties had policies updated 2 weeks before the fires. Always with the same insurance company, always with specific coverage for fire damage." The evidence was mounting, but we still needed something to connect Richard directly to the fires. That's when Derek called with a discovery that would change everything. "Eric, I need to see you right now. I found out who was actually setting the fires. And you won't believe who it is." As I drove to meet Derek, my mind was racing with possibilities. Each new piece of evidence confirmed that Richard wasn't just greedy, he was meticulous, calculated, and completely willing to destroy lives to increase his profits. But there was something he didn't know about me. I grew up watching my father work with his hands, fixing things that others considered beyond repair. I learned that complex problems often have simple solutions, if you're patient enough to find them. Richard thought he knew me, the artist nephew, idealistic, unprepared for the real world of business. What he didn't realize was that spending 5 years as a freelancer in Seattle taught me to be resilient, creative, and when necessary, relentlessly focused on results. He was about to find out that underestimating family can be the most expensive mistake anyone makes. And unlike his previous victims, I wasn't planning on taking the money and disappearing quietly. I was planning something much more permanent and public for Richard Morrison's legacy. Derek's revelation changed everything. We met in an abandoned parking lot in Georgetown, away from prying eyes. He seemed agitated, constantly checking to see if anyone was following us. "The guy setting fire to the buildings is Tommy Reeves," Derek said, showing me a photo on his phone. "Former electrician, lost his license to fraud 3 years ago. Now he works as a maintenance consultant for Richard's companies." The photo showed a thin man in his 40s with graying hair and empty eyes. The kind of person you forget 5 minutes after meeting him. "How did you find him?" Angela Torres remembered him. He showed up at her building a week before the fire, saying he was checking the electrical wiring. She thought it was strange because no one had requested an inspection. Derek handed me a folder. I was able to confirm that Tommy was at each of Richard's properties in the weeks leading up to the fires. Always with the same excuse, electrical problems that needed urgent attention. As I studied the documents, my mind began to formulate a plan. It wouldn't be enough to just expose Richard. He had too many lawyers and too many influential connections. We needed direct, irrefutable evidence that even the best lawyer couldn't contest. "Derek, can you find out when the next fire will be?" "Why do you want to know that?" "Because we're going to stop it from happening. And record Richard ordering the crime." Over the next few days, I immersed myself in a meticulous investigation that my father would have been proud of. I used every skill I had developed as a freelance designer, attention to detail, an ability to find patterns, and above all, the patience to work alone for long hours. Lisa helped me map out every property Richard had purchased in the last 2 years. We discovered that there were 8 buildings in his portfolio that hadn't yet accidentally caught fire. They all followed the same pattern: rent control, low-income tenants, located in neighborhoods undergoing gentrification. The most promising was an apartment building in Ballard called Riverside Commons. Richard had bought it 4 months ago, and the tenants were already receiving voluntary relocation offers, insultingly low offers to leave their apartments. "This is the next one," I told Derek when we met on Friday. "All the conditions are perfect. Tenants resisting the offers, insurance updated last week, and Tommy Reeves was seen in the building on Tuesday." Meanwhile, Richard's pressure intensified in a calculated and cruel way. He started showing up at places I frequented, the cafe where I worked, the laundromat, even the grocery store where I bought groceries. He never approached me directly, just stood there watching, reminding me of his constant presence. "Eric, you're being stubborn," he said when he finally cornered me on Friday night outside the building where Derek lived. "Your mother called today, worried. She said you seem unstable lately." "Leave my mother out of this. She's out of this. She just cares about her son who is clearly suffering a nervous breakdown after trauma." His voice carried a false concern that made me feel nauseous. "I've offered professional help. Therapy, rehab, whatever it takes." The manipulation was obvious but effective. To anyone who didn't know Richard, he sounded like a concerned uncle trying to help a troubled nephew. To me, it was pure blackmail. "And if I don't accept your help, then I'll have to take more drastic measures to protect you from yourself. Your mother agrees that a temporary stay in a facility may be necessary if you continue with these paranoid obsessions." The blood drained from my veins. He was threatening to have me committed, using my own mother as his unwitting accomplice. It was a brilliant and diabolical move. Who would question a concerned family member trying to help someone who had clearly lost touch with reality? "You have 48 hours to make a decision," Richard said, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive shirt. "Monday 9 in the morning, you show up at my office to start work. Or you show up at a clinic to start treatment." Her choice. That night, I called my mother. Her voice was heavy with genuine concern that broke my heart. "Honey, Richard told me about your episodes. The conspiracy theories, the refusal to accept help. He thinks you may be having a delayed reaction to the trauma of the fire." "Mom, these aren't conspiracy theories. I have evidence." "Of course you do, dear. But sometimes when we're hurting, our minds create patterns where none exist. Richard just wants to help. And so do I." The pain in her voice was real. Richard had planted seeds of doubt so skillfully that my own mother now saw my search for justice as a symptom of mental illness. If I continued to resist, she would actually support a preventive hospitalization. It was Derek who brought me back to focus. "Eric, I've got something important," he said when we met on Saturday morning. "One of the tenants at Riverside Commons is an electronics technician. He can install discrete recording equipment in the building." "That's risky. If they find out." "Riskier than letting Richard keep burning down buildings with people inside." Derek was right. "Besides, I have a contact at the FBI who's interested in large-scale insurance fraud cases." The mention of the FBI changed everything. We were no longer planning a personal vendetta, but building a federal case that could take down Richard and his entire operation. We spent the weekend working out every detail. Derek would coordinate with the tenant to install the cameras. Lisa would continue mapping the financial connections to strengthen the case. And I would do the hardest part. If you're following this journey to uncover the truth about family corruption, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see how this investigation unfolds. "I'm taking Richard's job," I announced on Sunday night. Derek looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Eric, after everything we've uncovered? I need to get inside his inner circle. Get access to the files, listen in on conversations, see how the operation really works." I took a deep breath. "And I need to record him admitting his crimes." "That's extremely dangerous. If he suspects." "He won't suspect because I'm going to give him exactly what he wants, a defeated and grateful nephew. I'll pretend that the pressure worked, that I finally saw reason." On Monday morning, I showed up at Richard's office wearing my only suit, with a carefully constructed expression of resignation. His assistant directed me to a conference room where he was waiting with contracts already prepared. "Eric, I'm glad you've made a smart decision," he said, extending his hand. "I know it wasn't easy, but sometimes growing up means accepting that certain fantasies have to end." I shook his hand with controlled force. "You were right, Uncle. About everything. I need stability." For a split second, I saw something flash across his eyes. Satisfaction, but also surprise. He had expected more resistance. "Great. Let's get started today. I have a few projects that need immediate attention." As I signed the papers, my mind was focused on the small recording device Derek had given me, hidden in my inside jacket pocket. From that moment on, every word Richard spoke would be documented. He thought he had finally broken my resistance, that I was just another victim silenced by his systemic manipulation. What he didn't know was that I had learned something valuable in the last few months. Sometimes the best way to destroy a predator is to let him think you're easy prey. The real hunt was just beginning. And this time, I wouldn't be the victim. My first week at Richard's office was a masterclass in patience and self-control. While he introduced me as my nephew who finally saw reason, I mentally catalogued every conversation, every document, every criminal connection that crossed my desk. The moment I had been waiting for arrived on Thursday afternoon. Richard received a call that completely changed his demeanor, from polished executive to something much more sinister. "Tommy, I need you to speed up the Riverside timeline," he said, believing I was busy with spreadsheets on my computer. "The tenants are organizing, they've hired a lawyer. It needs to happen this weekend." My blood ran cold. It was exactly what Derek had predicted, but 2 days earlier than expected. I kept typing as Richard gave detailed instructions on how to start the fire and make it look accidental. Use the same method as the Georgetown building. Start in the basement, on the wires near the heater. And Tommy, make sure it happens after 2 a.m., when everyone is fast asleep. When he hung up, I was shaking with controlled rage. I wasn't just hearing about insurance fraud, I was hearing the planning of a fire that could kill entire families. "Eric, are you okay?" Richard asked, noticing my tension. "Just tired. Still adjusting to business hours," I lied, forcing a smile. That night, I met Derek in an emergency situation. "We have to stop this," I said as soon as I heard the recording. "We can't let Tommy set fire to the building just to get evidence." "I agree, but if we stop him too soon, Richard will be suspicious. We need to catch him in the act." We spent the night devising a desperate plan. Derek would anonymously alert the fire department and police about a possible arson attempt at Riverside Commons. I would stay late at the office on Friday, waiting for further instructions from Richard that could incriminate him once and for all. Friday arrived with a tension I could physically feel. Richard was restless, constantly checking his phone, waiting for confirmation from Tommy. At 9 o'clock that night, when he thought I had left, I got the call that would seal his fate. "Tommy, where the hell are you? You should have started an hour ago," Richard yelled into the phone, his mask of professionalism finally slipping. "I don't care if there are police cars in the area. Find a way to get into that basement and finish the job." That was it. Direct, indisputable evidence, recorded in high definition. But Richard wasn't stupid. When he hung up the phone and turned around, he saw me standing in the office doorway with my cell phone in my hand. "How long have you been there, Eric?" "Long enough," I replied, my voice firmer than I expected. His eyes narrowed as he realized what was happening. "You were recording." "Every word. From day one." For a moment, we stood there, staring at each other like two predators sizing each other up. Then Richard started to laugh, a cold laugh that wasn't funny at all. "You really thought you were smarter than me, kid? You thought you could fool me?" He stood up slowly. "You know what's going to happen now? I'm going to call your mother and tell her you've had a complete nervous breakdown. That you broke into my office at night, threatened me, talked incoherently about fires and conspiracies." My stomach dropped. It was exactly the move I'd feared. "And you know what the best part is? She'll believe me. Because what respectful son spies on his own uncle? What stable person invents conspiracy theories about their family?" His confidence was returning. "On Monday, you'll be in a psychiatric clinic, and all these recordings will be considered the ravings of someone with mental problems." That's when I realized Richard was right about one thing. I really wasn't smarter than him. He was smarter, and he had anticipated this move. "You're right, Uncle. Mom would probably believe you," I said calmly, pulling another phone out of my pocket. "But it'll be hard to explain that to the federal agent listening to our conversation live." The blood drained from Richard's face. "Agent Morrison, are you listening to this?" I said into the phone. A female voice answered through the speaker, "Loud and clear, Eric. We have units heading to Riverside Commons now, and a team on the way there." Richard tried to run for the door, but it opened before he got there. 3 federal agents entered, guns drawn. "Richard Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit arson, insurance fraud, and witness tampering," announced the lead agent. As they cuffed him, Richard looked at me with a mixture of anger and disbelief. How? Derek had contacts in the FBI from the beginning. By the time we figured out the pattern of his fires, they were already investigating large-scale insurance fraud. I stepped closer as they escorted him away. The difference is, I'm not like your other victims. I grew up listening to you brag about your clever deals. I learned how you think. You destroyed our family, he spat. No, uncle. You did that when you decided that profit was worth more than human lives. I just made sure the consequences finally caught up with you. As they led him away, I received a message from Derek. Tommy was arrested trying to break into Riverside Commons. All the tenants are safe. That night, sitting alone in the office that had been Richard's just hours before, I called my mother. It was time to tell her the truth about everything, about Richard, about the fires, about how he had tried to use her as a weapon against me. It would be a difficult conversation, but a necessary one. Because some families need to be broken before they can be rebuilt on honest foundations. And as I looked out the window at the city Richard had tried to exploit, I knew that true revenge wasn't seeing him in prison. It was knowing that his next victims would sleep safely in their homes tonight. 6 months later, I sat in federal court watching Richard receive his sentence, 15 years in prison for criminal conspiracy, insurance fraud, and attempted murder. The judge was relentless, citing the flagrant disregard for human life in his operations. Tommy Reeves had become a cooperating witness, revealing devastating details about at least 17 arson fires over 5 years. The victims, including a family who nearly died in Ballard, testified about how Richard had destroyed their lives out of pure greed. The defendant turned housing into a commodity, treating human beings as disposable obstacles to profit, the judge declared before banging the gavel. My mother, who was initially shocked by the revelations, had now become my biggest supporter. I always knew there was something wrong with Richard, she admitted after the trial. But I never imagined this. Derek won an investigative journalism award for his series of reports exposing the entire operation. More importantly, his coverage led to a complete overhaul of the state's fire insurance laws. Lisa Chen and I started a consulting firm that helps victims of real estate fraud rebuild their lives. We use graphic design to create awareness campaigns and applied math to track criminal patterns. Riverside Commons was turned into permanent affordable housing, ensuring that working families would never again be driven out by predatory speculation. 3 weeks ago, I got a letter from the prison. Richard, apparently, wanted to make amends. I didn't open it. Some people deserve forgiveness, others deserve only the consequences of their choices. Today, when I wake up in my new apartment, bought with the settlement money I received, I don't feel anger. I feel purpose. Richard tried to break me to control me, but he only taught me that true power comes from protecting those who can't protect themselves. The laughter that night wasn't just relief that my belongings were safe. It was the unconscious recognition that some destruction paves the way for better rebuilding. If this story of how family greed turned into the greatest lesson in justice of their lives touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of people who turned betrayal into triumph. As for my uncle, I hear he's learning carpentry in prison. Maybe he'll finally learn to build something instead of just destroying it.